Now, without further ado, let's start the conference with our keynote speaker and Rice University graduate, Dr. Ed Feng. Ed earned his bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Rice University. His PhD is in applied math and chemical engineering from Stanford University. He is the founder and purveyor of the Power Rank, found at thepowerrank.com. Ladies and gentlemen, here is Ed Feng.
All right, thank you so much, Clark. I really appreciate it. And today I want to tell you two different stories about how to make sports predictions based on data. And the first story starts here at Rice University. I was an undergrad in the late 90s, and I got my degree in chemical engineering here. But more importantly, we won Beer Bike in 1999. This is a picture of my team from Will Rice College. And we actually won all three races that year in 1999. So Will Rice will sweep. And I really did love my time at Rice. I went on to get my graduate degree over at Stanford. You know, it was really tough going to such a less beautiful campus, but I did have a good experience there. And I worked in the chemical engineering department. I actually worked with a chemist named Hans Anderson. And we looked at the kinetic theory for lattice models of liquids and polymers. But more importantly, we really got into the mathematics behind Markov chains. And that is something that is going to be really important for the development of what I'm going to tell you about in this first story. So after a brief stop, postdoctoral stop in Santa Barbara, I went on to Berkeley. I was a Miller Fellow at Berkeley. And I went in with these aspirations of getting into academia and becoming a professor. And things didn't work out at all for me at Berkeley. And it was mostly due to my own stubbornness. But that was definitely the beginning of the end of my academic research career. So, you know, kind of on my way out, I was trying to figure out what I could do that related my research to sports. I'd always been a big sports fan. And part of that answer started with web search. So if you remember in the early 90s, web search was a hot mess. So you would go to a site like Alta Vista, you would type in Eubank conference, and the results would be complete gobbledygook. It would just have it would have no relation to anything of what you were looking for. So that all changed in the late 90s. A website called Google came along, started at Stanford. In fact, it started at one of the dorms that I actually lived in later as a grad student. And now you had this search engine, Google, and now you type in Eubank conference and magically you get the right site. You would get the site for the Eubank conference at Rice University. And so what Google did was they used the link structure of the web in order to tell which websites were the most important and which websites were the least. So this is the PageRank algorithm. And the basic idea is that these circles are websites. And the circle B is an important website because there's a lot of incoming links from other websites. And so back in the day, that might have been yahoo.com. Now, website C only has one incoming link, but it's an important one because it's an important one from an important website B, yahoo.com back then. So that gives importance to C. A website like A also has one incoming link, but it's not as important because it's from a less important website. So PageRank is the stationary distribution of a Markov chain. And a Markov chain is simply a random process. And for the web search analogy, you can think about it in terms of a web surfer, a random web surfer. So a web surfer goes to a site, gets bored, looks at all the outbound links at random, picks one, goes to another site, gets bored, chooses from one of the outbound links, and keeps going. And that defines the Markov chain. And PageRank is still simply the stationary distribution of that Markov chain. You can think about that as time goes into infinity. The weight that every site gets is proportional to the amount of time that random surfer spends on that website. So this was pretty cool because this is exactly the math that I had studied in doing statistical mechanics in both my PhD and other places. So I started thinking, well, how can I apply this to sports? And you can't just apply PageRank to sports. The link structure only gives you ones and zeros. I guess the general idea is the websites now become teams. The link structure is related to games played between teams. So if you directly apply PageRank, you're just looking at wins and losses, right? You're looking at who beat who. And the research that I've done has shown that you can't make accurate predictions going forward using only wins and losses. So you really need to incorporate statistics of what happened in the game. And the most simple statistic is margin of victory. So this is a plot of college basketball teams, and on the x-axis is margin of victory, average margin of victory over the course of the season. You can see that's pretty equally spread around 0, which is what you would expect. And that's mapped against the y-axis, which is winning percentage for each one of those teams. So you can see that this is like an S-shaped curve. It's like a Fermi function that you could fit. You could fit a Fermi function to this, and that's exactly what I did. And that gives me a way to map margin of victory, which is in principle an unbounded quantity, to win percentage, which is a bounded quantity between 0 and 1. And this win percentage ends up being like the transition probabilities between teams. So now instead of a random web surfer, now we're talking about a fan. So a fan is going to be a fan of one team, but he's kind of a fair weather fan. So if another team beats his team by a lot, he's more likely to go to that team because he's, again, fair weather. If the team that he's on beats a team by a lot, he's not as likely to go to that team. So, this fan is just going to pick between these teams based on what happens with these win-losses according to the margin of victory in games. So this is how I started the power rank. This started 2008, 2009. And I can use it to make predictions. And so this is some of my NFL results. So these are the NFL results from the end of the NFL season. So essentially what we're doing is we're taking margin of victory and we're adjusting for strength of schedule. So Kansas City was the best team, and this was after the end of the season. So how do I get a prediction, right? So Kansas City played Tampa Bay in the Super Bowl. Kansas City has a rating of 7.5. Tampa Bay has a rating of 6.2. So to get a prediction on a neutral site like the Super Bowl, you would just take the difference. You would take the difference between the two ratings. So the prediction would say that Kansas City would beat Tampa Bay by 1.3 points in the Super Bowl. So that was clearly not a correct prediction in terms of who was going to win the game. But I would like to point out the markets favored Kansas City by 3. This prediction suggested taking the side of Tampa Bay +3 in that game, which is something I did. These types of calculations were one reason. There's obviously a lot of other information that goes into finally making a bet. But with Tampa Bay actually winning the game outright, that turned out to be a pretty good prediction and something that worked out for me. So the power rank started out as these team rankings and making predictions in this way. The methods have really developed a lot over the last decade. And so how are my best predictions doing? Well, to do that, you want to look at the RMS error of a spread prediction to the actual game results. So my prediction was Kansas City was going to win by 1.3 points. Tampa Bay actually won the game by 22 points. Again, kind of embarrassing unless you had Tampa Bay side. So the difference is going to be 23.3 points. And the RMS square, you're just going to square that quantity, average that over all the games that you're looking at, and then take the square root. So you're getting a metric in terms of points and not points squared. So you can look at these predictions, and first you kind of compare it to the gold standard, which are the markets. The closing markets, what I do is I take the results from Don Best that look at sports books, the top sports books, most of them offshore, and I take the median prediction there, and I compare that to what actually happened in games, and you get an RMS error of about 12.85 points. Over the last 2 years in the NFL, my member predictions have an RMS error of about 12.93 points, so that's slightly bigger, but it is within 0.5% of what the market error is. And it's very close, and it's certainly very useful for being one part of your betting process. So you can also look at how the predictions do against the spread. And the predictions have won at 52.7% against the spread. That is a profitable margin, although I highly recommend not just taking the numbers-based predictions and betting them, because the NFL is a very hard league to beat, if not the most difficult. I did take a 2-year spread because you do have a small sample size in the NFL. And I believe the ATS record this year was about 55%, which is something I don't think is sustainable long-term. So I like to take a bigger sample of 2 years to get a more realistic idea of what the numbers can do. So with these team rankings, that's kind of the end of the first story about how I make predictions on my site, but that's never a perfect thing. That you can always do better. And there's always work to be done. And one of the primary things that can be done better is turnovers. So turnovers are kind of notoriously random. And the conventional story is something like what Bill Barnwell told in Grantland back in the day. Are turnovers predictive, right? So his example was Pittsburgh's defense had only forced 2 turnovers the first 5 games of the season. So is that predictive of the Steelers' defense going forward? So Bill did this research and looked at the correlation between turnovers forced the first 5 games, and then he looked at turnovers forced the remainder of the season over a pretty big sample set of NFL games. And what he found is that there was no correlation between those 2 quantities. And what that means is, like, turnovers are not predictive. Turnovers forced in the first 5 games have little to say with what's going to happen the rest of the season. You get some serious regression to the mean. And so that also means that turnovers are very hard to predict. The same is true on offense. When you look at fumbles, when you look at interceptions, it's very hard to take that raw quantity and predict what's going to happen in the future. And this is a real problem with making predictions, right? So think about Jameis Winston. We know that he is a quarterback that over his career has had a higher than NFL interception rate. He has thrown interceptions in 3.4% of his passes. That's significantly higher than the NFL average these days, about 2.4%. So what happens if you're 6 games into the season and Jameis has only thrown 1 or 0 interceptions? All your metrics that I talked about, all those team rankings, which take margin of victory and adjust for strength of schedule, they're going to be too high on this team. So we really want to dig in and try to make a better prediction. So after the 2018 season, kind of the off season, early in the year 2019, I started to dig into this. And actually that was inspired by David Hale. He's a writer for ESPN, but I'm always impressed when these writers actually dig into the data. And he did that. And he found that every FBS team has a positive turnover margin. This is in college football. So they have a positive turnover margin when they're already ahead on the scoreboard. And only about 1/3 of turnovers are committed when that team is ahead. And only 14% of turnovers are committed by the team that's ahead by a touchdown or more. So it's kind of a chicken and egg question, right? If you don't turn over the ball, does that mean you win? Or do you only not turn over the ball because you're ahead? And the logic there is, like, if you're ahead in the game, you're going to tend to run the ball more. You're not going to take risks in the passing game. If you're behind in the fourth quarter, you're certainly going to take risks in order to try to win that football game. So again, in the off season of 2019, I started looking into this for the NFL and just checking to see whether you get the same things, same kind of results. And so from 2016 to 2018 in the NFL, about 29% of turnovers are committed when the team is ahead. Not quite as much as the 33% in college football, but basically the same range of results. When a team is ahead by 7 or more points, 19% of turnovers are committed then. So again, a little bit more than college football, but we're seeing the same trends. I'm actually more interested in kind of predicting turnover rates, because those are really what's important. It's important to get that normalization. So I started looking at interception rates. And you see a drastic difference when a team is behind, where it's a 2.7% interception rate, versus when they're ahead, which is a 2.0% interception rate. So context also matters. Like, the game situation also matters as well. If it's 3rd, 4th down, you have 10 or more yards to go, you're much more likely to be chucking the ball downfield, maybe throwing in the double coverage. And the results certainly show that. 3.2% interception rate for third and fourth down with 10 or more yards. And then compared to 2.4% on all other pass plays. These plays on third and fourth and long are a pretty small sample. So that 2.4 is pretty close to what the NFL average was over those 3 seasons. So I did part of that work in the 2019 offseason, and then we're heading into 2020, and I go to the Sloan Sports Analytics Conference like I do every year. And I came back sick from that conference, and it turned out that me and a bunch of friends had all contracted COVID during that time. And it was a kind of remarkable experience. I actually tested negative when I got back, even though I was sick. And I only suspect that I was positive because everyone that I was with during that conference tested positive later. And it was just kind of a surreal experience. The picture in the bottom with the guy in the cigar, that was a picture from outside a cigar bar that we all ended up going to. And we were all crammed into this 10 by 10 room with cigar smoke and a lot of COVID in the room. I actually would have been the 3rd case in Michigan when I got back. And this was like early in March when it was the week before everyone started taking it seriously. Because when I was sick, when I came back, we all know what happened. The NCAA tournament gets canceled. And it was a really dark time for sports and sports analytics. I think this picture is particularly appropriate here because that's Rudy Gobert. He was the first NBA player to contract the disease. And that was the NBA suspended their season and the NCAA tournament gets canceled. I'm a huge basketball fan. I love March Madness more than any other yearly event. So it was really hard. I found some solace in reading some books, Red Gravity's Rainbow, and only that kind of helped me through that dark time and dealing with a lot of family issues and kids at home from school. So it took me a while to figure out what I was going to do because the power rank had been doing really well, but now all of a sudden we don't know whether there's football in the fall. I actually considered starting a math tutoring business just as a backup plan. But later in that offseason, I started getting back to this issue of turnovers. And, I was thinking, how can we find a better betting edge with turnovers? So not just, not just saying what the rates are, but like, how can we actually predict this? And again, I want to bring you back to Jameis Winston, right? So if he tends to throw more picks, what if he goes a 6-game stretch where he only throws 1 interception? However, it's the same old Jameis, right? He's throwing a lot of balls. Defenders are getting their hands on the balls, but just dropping them. So you can tell that there's some aspect of luck involved. Now, when I first started getting back into this research last year in 2020, I wanted to check some results in college football that and seeing if we were seeing the same thing with interception rates. And you indeed see the same things in college football as in the NFL, whether a team is behind or whether it's ahead. So in college football, the interception rate is 3.3% when a team is behind. It's 2.3% when the team is ahead. And so this increase is about 40% in college football, which is significantly more than the analogous 26% increase in the NFL. So then, I kind of got excited about this, being able to predict interceptions in college football would probably have a bigger impact on your predictions than the analogous predictions in the NFL. Of course, as we go further through last offseason during the pandemic, it was very uncertain whether college football was going to happen, even more so than the NFL. And then I kind of got obsessed with another fact in kind of studying turnovers. And that's this fact. For an NFL offense, about 1 in 3 fumbles happen on quarterback sacks. This is all fumbles, not just fumbles lost. And I found this remarkable. So we all know the NFL is a quarterback league. You don't have to look too far past their salaries to determine that. And we know the NFL is a passing game. We know the passing game is important, despite all the pundits that will tell you need to establish the run. So we know all that. But this was saying on top of that, quarterbacks have a big impact on the number of fumbles that happen. And so they're even more important, right? And so how a quarterback handles the ball, his pocket presence, whether he's able to sense a defender coming and prevent, on a sack, prevent a strip sack is a huge thing. So I ended up going down this rabbit hole for a while and calculated some results over a 3-season period. And I apologize for just kind of throwing the raw data out here at you, but I want to point out a couple things. So this is quarterback fumble rates on sacks. And the better ones are at the bottom. So 43 is Lamar Jackson, 7.8% fumble rate on sacks. Deshaun Watson of the Texans is about 8%. So these are low. Cam Newton is number 40 on this list. He's 8.4%. And then you kind of look at the other end. And I would say these quarterbacks that tend to not fumble as much, tend to be your more athletic quarterbacks. You look at some of the more pocket passers. So you look at a guy like Eli Manning, number 9 on this list. So he fumbles on 20% of sacks. You have Drew Brees, 15th on the list. He fumbles on 14.6%. And so you kind of have these hypotheses, do athletic quarterbacks tend to fumble less on sacks? And is that important? Is that an edge that we can exploit? I also want to point out Carson Wentz on this list, number 7. He tends to fumble over 20% of sacks, which I thought was pretty interesting. I apologize in advance. I'm going to talk about Carson Wentz again later in this talk. I apologize in advance to Eagles fans. So I started thinking about this, but I didn't actually take this to completion, which is why I'm showing you kind of this raw data-ish, because I didn't end up taking this to completion. And the reason why is because I started thinking about how to make the most impact in terms of things that would affect the betting line, things that would affect the prediction the most. And when you just kind of do some analysis on the frequency of turnovers, so this is the 2019 system, the 2019 season, there were 648 fumbles, not fumbles lost, fumbles. So if roughly a third of them are quarterback sacks, that's about 216-ish fumbles that happen on quarterbacks and sacks. And remember, not all of these are going to get recovered. Not all of these are turnovers. They're not all going to get recovered by the defense. Some fraction of those, roughly 50%, are going to end up as turnovers. Whereas on the other hand, there were 410 interceptions in the NFL in 2019. So my thinking was like, if I can make a dent in how to predict interceptions, that would be more worthwhile for members of my site and people, who want to make better predictions. So I got back into interception rate, and that is the key that I want to predict for the NFL. And this is kind of late in August. I think probably by then the Big Ten and the Pac-12 had decided they were not playing college football, and it looked like the other conferences we were going to follow. So it was really, for me, all about, it was a focus on the NFL at this point. So let's just look at some basic data, right? We told before about how turnovers aren't predictive. And this is just another plot to show that. So this is interception rate for individual quarterbacks. On the x-axis, you're looking at it last season. And then on the y-axis, you're looking at the same quarterback's interception rate the current season. And we ask what the correlation is, right? And you can see the wide scatter of points. The correlation is very weak. The R-squared is about 7%. And so interception rate isn't sticky. It's not predictive from season to season for NFL quarterbacks. So how can we do better? Well, the inspiration came from Bill Connolly. Bill Connolly is with ESPN. He's a college football writer, and he's a college football analytics guy, one of the best in the business. Back when he was at SB Nation, he used to write about a preview for every college football team. And in 2014, he was writing about Houston. And the guy in the picture is John O'Korn. So the previous year, he had been a freshman quarterback. He had had a really great season. But Bill made the following observation. He said, luck allowed Houston to keep some games closer than they probably should have. Against UCF and Louisville, opponents picked off just 2 O'Korn passes while breaking up 17. And the idea here is if defenses are breaking up a lot of a quarterback's passes, some of those will inevitably become interceptions. And for O'Korn to only have 2 of those passes in these games become interceptions, that was unsustainable. And Bill did the work to show that, there was a very steady relationship between the fraction of passes defended that ended up as interceptions, and quarterbacks that deviate from that will tend to see big time regression to the mean. So I started thinking about this in terms of NFL based on Bill's idea. And the way I kind of put it together in the end was I defined something called bad balls. So interceptions are clearly bad balls, they're turnovers. But anytime a pass is defended is anytime the defense gets his hand on the ball. So it is a situation in which the quarterback is putting the ball in a bad situation. Okay, so that's why it's called bad balls, in a dangerous situation. And then in the NFL, about 21% of bad balls end up as interceptions, and quarterbacks have almost no control over that quantity whatsoever by my work. So we can ask about bad ball rate. So the fraction of bad balls divided by pass attempts. And this is the same plot that I showed with interception rate earlier. Bad ball rate from last season is on the x-axis, while bad ball rate from the current season is on the y-axis. And all of a sudden, the scatter of points isn't so wide. You get an R-squared of about 27%, and this is pretty remarkable. So bad ball rate tends to be sticky from season to season. And when we think about quarterback statistics, it's about as sticky as quarterback statistics come. So this plot shows the same plot. The plot on the last slide is on the right here. And then we're showing the same quantity for completion percentage for a quarterback. And we see that that has about roughly the same R-squared value when you're looking from season to season. So bad ball rate tends to be sticky. It tends to be predictive. Now, I know there's probably a grad student, postdoc listening to this talk thinking, hey, man, this guy was like writing down Markov chains and developing models for team rankings in the beginning. And now a decade later, he's just looking at correlations between quantities. And I just want to say, I hear you, because I would have thought the same thing in your shoes. So when you look at all of this, the conclusion that I found was that 3 years of bad ball rate tends to be the best predictor of interceptions going forward. So let's look at what those interceptions said about the 2020 season. And again, I have to offer my apologies to Eagles fans because I got to talk about Carson Wentz, because he was the one that really stood out in the data. You look at a 3-year period, and 2017 to 2019, he had an incredible interception rate, 1.5%, significantly less than the NFL average of 2.4%. But when you looked at his bad ball rate, it was about 10.7%, which was pretty close to the NFL average of 11%. And this suggests that his interception rate was unsustainable. And that's exactly what happened in 2020. Over the season, he had a 3.4% interception rate. It was well north of 5%. At some point last season, Wentz did not have a good season, to say the least. Lost his job to Jalen Hurts late in the season and is now an Indianapolis Colt. So the other quarterback I have to bring up, giving this talk at Rice, is Deshaun Watson. He's the Houston Texans quarterback, who I believe is one of the 2 most valuable assets in the NFL. And when you looked at his numbers over a 3-year span, he had a 2.3% interception rate, pretty average. But, Deshaun Watson's an incredibly accurate passer. And over the 3-year period, when you look at his bad ball rate, it was 9%. So significantly better than the NFL average of 11%. And so the prediction was that, he would have a better interception rate in 2020. And he did. He had a pick rate of 1.3% this past season. And I find that particularly remarkable because Deshaun Watson didn't have a defense. The defense was terrible before they suffered some key injuries in the secondary towards the later part of the season. They didn't win a lot of games, and that means they were down a lot. And Deshaun Watson was in those situations where he is more likely to throw picks. He didn't. He still had a remarkable interception rate this past season. And part of the reason why I think he's definitive one of the top 2 assets in the NFL. Thank you for listening to this talk. My name is Ed Fang. I really want to thank Professor Happenstall for inviting me here. When my academic career started to go haywire at Berkeley, I never thought I'd be able to give a talk at a conference like this in an academic setting, much less an institution that I love in Rice University. So thanks for listening.
Ed, thank you very much. Great job. We're going to jump right in to the panel discussion. Ed, I do have a couple of questions that I'm going to start the panelist that, when we start the panel discussion, a couple of questions that came in for you about your presentation. If we could Let's ask one of them because we're going to have to do a little bit of work to try and get the panelists set up. The first question was, how is your method of prediction different from multiple regression?
So it kind of depends on what you're talking about. When you go to like the team rankings, when you're doing team rankings, you essentially want to take a quantity like margin of victory, or in a more advanced setting, you want to take something like success rate in football, and you want to adjust for strength of schedule. You can actually do that with regression type techniques. It's not a bad thing to do. So you can use regression to do those types of things. Multilinear regression was a big part of how I figured out that 3 years of bad ball rate was kind of optimal for predicting interceptions going forward. I'm not sure that answers the question, but yeah, regression is always playing a part. I think with kind of the way that I do team rankings with the algorithm I developed, it's a little bit better because it tends to de-weight outliers. I think 1 year New England beat Tennessee by like 40 some points, and that ended up not affecting my predictions as much. Whereas a regression that uses the square of like the air would have bumped up New England a lot more because of that blowout win.
Another question. We're trying to set up one last panelist. Who is the number one asset in your mind? Is it Wilson, Mahomes, or Wentz?
It's not Wentz. No, I mean I think Patrick Mahomes is the most valuable asset in the NFL. I don't think Deshaun Watson is too far behind in terms of pure talent. I actually like watching Watson play more, just the way he throws the ball. And I think with the right system and like a defense that's not awful, you're going to see that guy win some Super Bowls.
Can you share more on the idea of what you studied or learned with your PhD versus the statistical skill set that you find yourself using? Said another way, to what extent can you apply the most advanced math you learned at Stanford versus what you've learned kind of on your own?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that kind of speaks to the heart of what I was trying to say about the grad student or postdoc that was looking at this work. I really enjoyed my time at Rice and Stanford and all the deep math that I learned, and I wouldn't give that up for anything. And I would encourage everyone to take math as far as you can tolerate it in some sense, right? That's always going to be useful. That's what I believe. I think it's always useful, whether you're doing like pure math that looks like it has no applications. Maybe 10 years later, it's like the most important thing in cryptography. I believe that there is power in studying that math, and you never know. For me, it just ended up being some of the math ended up being useful for ranking sports teams, whereas that was no way part of my motivation for studying it initially. But also, I would also say that now. My approach is less about like, how can I do math? Like, how can I make a better machine learning algorithm? And it's more like, how can I solve someone's problem? And oftentimes when you're solving someone's problem, you start with regression. We all do, right? If you're trying to look at the relationships between variables, you're going to ask for, some simple regression analysis. There's nothing wrong with that. It's the way all of us start to approach problems. And so, yeah, those are kind of two sides of the coin, I think. And they're both important.
Great. Thank you, Ed.